because this is definitely what we get asked about most. I get asked about this all the time because even when I'm coaching clients, one of the things that people have lots of concerns about are the nuances of programming. And I always encourage my clients to ask me questions about why I've made particular decisions. And very often the answers end up being a little bit underwhelming, I think, for some clients, because some clients expect there to be a very specific reason for every decision that has been made. That there's going to be some specific prescription that's going to get them the best results. When in reality, a lot of my decisions end up being quite practical, that I might have them do one rep range for one exercise and a different rep range for the next, because it gives them a bit of novelty, it modifies the stimulus a bit. It's not necessarily that doing 15 reps after you've done 12 reps is anything special. And I think a lot of people will take those practical concerns or logistical concerns and try to make some sort of mechanistic hypothesis as to why it's superior. But really what they're doing is they're just applying some sort of, post hoc reasoning as to why they do what they do to make it sound more complicated than it is. So I'm often very honest with my clients and just say, look, not every training decision has to have a specific physiological rationale, because one of the main things we're trying to get people to do is to adhere to their training programs, which is very, very difficult to do, even for those of us who are experienced with training for many years. So when you begin looking at a training program, you have to consider a few different things. Now, some of these are very much interlinked, or could even be considered the same thing sometimes, but it's worth trying to understand these components anyway. Because, for example, if you look at these two things in comparison, when people think about nutrition, the simple person, the person on the street might just tell you, if you want to lose weight, just eat less. And that's absolutely true. If someone's telling you, or you're asking someone how to build muscle and get stronger, they might say, go to the gym and just train hard. People used to say that all the time, just train hard. But it's like, okay, that's actually fine, that will take you to a certain level, but what does that mean? And on the nutrition side of things, we start to break things down into calories, protein, carbohydrates, fats. So we're trying to break down our nutrition and ask ourselves, what are the component parts here and how can I move them to get the best results? And that's effectively what people are trying to do with training as well, where we take that going to the gym and training hard and we ask ourselves, okay, what does that mean? And we break it down into volume or sets. So how many sets are we doing for a given muscle group or a given exercise, either per session or per week? Okay, that's generally how we break things down, just out of convention and simplicity. People can think of things in terms of a week. So that's the first thing. Then people think of intensity. So one would be like absolute intensity, or how much weight you're lifting. How much weight you're actually lifting is not generally what we're concerned with. Generally, we're concerned with relative intensity, and particularly either the percentage of your one rep max or the RPE, or reps in reserve. So effectively, how hard is this weight for you? Are you pushing yourself close to failure? That's the second thing people typically think of, because if you're doing 30 sets, but you're doing it, 5 reps with 20% of your one rep max, like maybe minor health benefits, but are you going to be getting significantly stronger or bigger from lifting at such a low level of effort? Probably not.
That's something to really just remember, because you will see people do this where they're like, oh, I just kind of stick to the same stuff. And they started off lifting, I don't know, whatever, a 5 kilo dumbbell, and they'll just stay at that 5 kilo dumbbell, even though they actually have the capacity to do 10, 15, even 20 kilos. And they're like, oh, well, I'm still doing the same stuff that I was previously doing. But right now, because you have advanced, you are now doing a much lower percentage of your actual like full capacity, right? And as a result of that, yeah, I'm not going to say don't train, you're still getting some benefits from that, especially what do you want to call it, like metabolic health benefits, from contracting your muscles, moving blood glucose, etc. But it's not going to be the thing that gets you to a stage where you're like, oh, I'm actually building muscle, or I'm actually getting stronger more and more and more each week, because you've kind of tapped everything out that you get from those like beginner gains, and you're still doing the exact same stuff that you were doing. And you see that all the time. Like someone will say, oh, I don't know, squat one plate each side, so 60 kilos overall on the bar. And it's like, yeah, and how long have you been doing that? And they're like, oh, for the last year. And it's like, okay, well, we need to do something to move the needle forward. And there's a few different variables, like Gary has been touching on. that we can do. Yeah, maybe you stay at the same reps and the same, relative intensity, but now we're doing more and more sets. We're just doing like 20 sets now of this one exercise. But like Gary was saying earlier on, in terms of the practicality, most people are not going to want to do 20 sets of squats in a single workout. Most people are not going to be able to afford that much time doing 20 sets of just one exercise in a given workout. So we have to come up with more practical ways of actually advancing our training.
Absolutely. So look, very simply, from an intensity perspective, we're interested in whether or not someone is taking their training close to the point of failure. We'll add some more nuances to that in a moment, but close to the point of failure is fine for now. The third consideration is frequency. How often are you, well, one, how often are you training? How many sessions per week in total, because that's relevant to your volume, but also, and this is the context in which people use the term frequency more often, that is, how often are you training a particular muscle group or exercise per week? And this is something that's very relevant. I think some people probably take this too far. They worry that, training a muscle group once per week just isn't enough, because they've seen maybe people claim that twice per week is better, which is generally true, I think. But once per week, many people have had fantastic results from that. And just because something is better doesn't mean that you can't train once per week. And what I might do sometimes with clients is, maybe there's muscle groups that they've already gotten nailed. They're their best muscle groups, best exercises, and we really want to focus on something else. We might put those muscle groups just once per week. We might put the muscle groups in the middle where they want to develop them, but not as a primary priority, twice per week. And then the muscle groups they want to emphasize the absolute most, that they're like, this is really what I want to focus on, we might train that 3+ times per week. Okay. So like when you think of frequency, it's not a static recommendation. And again, I'm going to come back to that as we move along. Exercise selection, of course, is a consideration of great importance. And often the good thing here is that proper or good exercise selection can be actually learned through intuition or experience. And what I mean by that is that if you do an exercise and you can turn around after that and say, my God, that chest press, it just lit up my chest. My chest is burning. I got a ruthless pump. None of my joints are aching. It just feels like I trained that muscle. You don't need to understand anything else about the mechanics of that exercise, about the range of motion that you used, or anything in order to say, this is probably an effective chest exercise. I'm probably going to increase the strength and muscle mass in my chest if I continue to do this exercise.
Or just another way of seeing that as well would be, oh, that muscle group that I was training, that was the one that was the failure point. It wasn't, again, like you said, like your joints or your elbow or whatever else. It wasn't something else other than, again, like in this example, your chest. You do an exercise and you get to that failure point, you're doing it and you're like, it's your chest that is failing. It's not, oh, my triceps are the thing that, my chest still has, 50% left in the tank, but my triceps are giving out, or my elbow or my shoulder or whatever else is.
Yeah, and you can look at that then from the inverse in terms of like, right, we know that if you feel all those positive things is probably a good exercise. Then if you don't feel any of those things, you're experiencing just the negatives, then it's probably not a great exercise for you. And people plow on with exercises like that all of the time.
We've done it. We've done it.
100%. They'll be like, I've been squatting for 4 years. Okay. I've increased my squat strength, but every time I squat, the limiting factor is my low back. I've got this constant ache in the left side of my low back that's never going away. It gets worse from squatting. And because I keep squatting, it doesn't seem to go away. And, they don't feel like their quads are getting much of a pump. Their quads haven't really grown. They've gotten a bit stronger, but that wasn't really their primary goal. So clearly that's not a great exercise for that person. And if someone was to use an arbitrary rule of thumb, like barbell exercises are better and squatting deep is better, then they've missed out on the very clear biofeedback that they've been getting to say that maybe this isn't the best exercise for you. So in general, using those kind of simple pieces of feedback is a good way to get started with considering the exercises that you're doing. In general, there are like practical rules of thumb where, like, if you're training a particular muscle, you should feel that muscle working as the primary muscle group. You should also be able to work the muscle through a relatively large range of motion. It's generally a good thing to be able to achieve. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to achieve the same range of motion or that you need to exaggerate how deep you're going at the expense of maybe movement to other joints or the involvement of other muscles. But in general, there should be a pretty large and pretty standardized as well range of motion. So, if you're standing upright with a barbell row and you bend forward just a few inches, from the upright position, you're kind of just doing a bit of a shrug. It's clearly not the best version of that exercise for the muscles you're trying to work. So in general, you want to choose exercises and choose techniques that allow you to use a large range of motion, that allow you to feel relatively pain-free while doing that, and that the muscle you're training is the one that's stimulated and the one that's becoming the limiting factor. There's plenty more nuanced points related to, resistance profiles and stability, and X, Y, and Z, but they're beyond the scope of this podcast to go deep on exercise selection. So there's some of the kind of fundamental starting principles. There are other things for sure that get a bit more into the exercise itself, such as rest periods, for example. In general, you want to have rest periods somewhere between 1 to 3 minutes most of the time between your sets. If your rest periods are too short, that can make you feel like you're getting a better stimulus sometimes. You'll feel your muscles burning more, you'll be more short of breath, probably sweating more, the exercise will feel harder. But generally, what ends up happening is that some of those sensory components, like if you're really short of breath and your muscles are already burning, it can limit your ability to push yourself going into that next set. And you're lifting far less weight, you're lifting for far less reps, and you don't have the same commitment to push yourself to failure again because of all of those sensory aspects that are making it, clearly unfavorable for you to keep pushing yourself. So shorter rest periods can be used sparingly, especially when trying to save time or doing exercises where they're generally more isolation type movements. Towards the end of a workout is when I generally use that. But when you're trying to build strength and you're doing heavy multi-joint compound movements like squats, deadlifts, bench presses, barbell rows, etc., I'd very rarely be going anywhere less than a minute to a minute and a half, and generally more in the 2 to 3 minute range for those strength exercises, or even longer if you're doing very low reps. And then for exercises that maybe are somewhere in between the isolation and the heavy compound exercises, like maybe you're doing a chest press machine for sets of 12 to 15, somewhere between 1 and 2 minutes is typically fine. So they're fairly simple recommendations related to rest periods. Tempo is obviously something that falls into this conversation as well. And that's basically the cadence of your repetition and how much time you spend in each respective portion of the repetition. There aren't actually hard recommendations related to repetition tempo. Generally, what you see is that reps that take between 3 and 8 seconds per rep tend to lead to the same amounts of muscle hypertrophy, at least in the research that's been done. Now, there might be nuances to that where it's different between different exercises, and I would definitely hypothesize that to be the case. But in general, my rule of thumb for people is that you should be feeling the target muscle working pretty much at every point in the rep. You should feel that you're not bouncing or using extraneous movement to move the weight. And you should feel that at any point in the rep, you're the one controlling it and you could stop the weight. An example of where you might contrast a good and a bad case of that would be on a bench press. I'm sure if you're listening, you've seen people in the gym drop the barbell from the top, smacks off their sternum. You're almost waiting to hear the crack of their ribs, and then they bounce it back up and they manage to get the weight up. But if you ask yourself, could they have brought that weight to a controlled pause and still lift the weight? It's very, very unlikely that they could have. So they weren't really in control throughout the rep. And the bounce that they got off their sternum and the lack of muscular work that was done on the way down was what contributed them to be able to actually perform that repetition. So in general, you should be controlling the descent of your reps, or eccentric portion in particular. Some exercises you'd want to add a pause in the bottom or stretched position. Okay, it's obviously the top if it's like a lat pull down or something like that. But it's some exercises where, especially those where it's very easy to use a bounce, you want to pause in that stretch position. And also there's exercises where you're trying to emphasize the training stimulus in that stretch position. An example of that would be like the bench press, for example. If you know that you're very keen on bouncing off your chest, practicing pause reps can be really, really helpful. Similarly, if you're always bouncing into the bottom of your squats and then you lose your positioning, practicing pause squats can be really helpful. Again, if you're trying to maybe from a sporting perspective, if you're trying to emphasize the length and range of hamstring strengthening, if you're doing your seated leg curls, your Romanian deadlifts, you might want to pause in the stretch position to really focus on that specific training adaptation. So there are some examples of where tempo becomes relevant. It doesn't have to be super, super slow, but it shouldn't be super fast either. So somewhere in general between 3 seconds and 8 seconds per rep is probably a good idea. So if you find yourself in the gym doing a set of 10 and it's only taking you 10 to 15 seconds, you probably want to slow that down a bit. And one of the ways you can do that is to start timing your sets. Some people do that, and that can be actually a really nice way of standardizing the stimulus that you're applying. So
Some
that's
people
probably,
also get like metronome things in their
yeah,
like ears, it's like, so they hear the tick, 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 tick.
yeah,
I don't go that far. But just before we move on, I always say to clients, like, look, you should be in charge. You are the one that's in charge. The weight that you put on the bar, the fucking whatever machine you're using, that's not in charge. You are the one in charge. If you are in charge, why are you letting this weight abuse you? Like, why are you letting this weight like bounce off you? You weren't in charge and that turned a direction. And that's not to say, again, like, you always have to be the one in charge. Some exercises you're going to want a little bit of a bounce. There might be some reasons between or for the particular way you perform an exercise. But if you're going to make a rationale for a certain way to perform an exercise, you have to be very clear on why you're doing that. Like, it's not necessarily the best practice to do. Again, the best practice here is you should be in charge. An example, like we've discussed before and we've heard before, I can't actually remember where we heard it. But like, when you think of doing an exercise, you should be thinking of it in terms of those end ranges of motion. It's like reversing your car into it. You're just reversing into that position and then you're coming back out. Like, you wouldn't reverse or even drive into that position in sixth gear and expect it to be perfect. Like, it's just not going to happen. You're going to ease into that position. And it's the same with exercise here. You're going to get into, you're in this very length and range position. You should be easing into it. You should be in control. You should be in charge throughout the movement, and then go forward from there.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, sometimes people will say like that, it just doesn't matter, once you're going like to the same level close to failure using the same weights, it doesn't matter, what your tempo is. People will say that, there's no increased risk of injury or anything. But I mean, an easy way to kind of, I guess, debunk that through experience is try out jiu-jitsu. Let someone put a kimura or some sort of arm lock on you and ask them to do it slowly or do it super quickly and crank it on and see which one makes you scream.
Easiest way to see that in the jiu-jitsu context would be just an armbar, straight armbar.
Yeah.
Would you rather someone jumped and got you into an armbar, or would you rather someone just slowly leaned back into an armbar? I know what fucking one I would rather.
And that's the exact same with weight training, because what you have to remember with weight training as well is like, there is always the risk of, you failing a rep, and different exercises carry different risk. So if you bounce into the bottom of a squat and you're coming and all that weight is clattering down on your knee joints and you're unable to lift the weight up, like, that weight is accelerating towards the floor. So that's going to be like leading to massive increases in forces at that point. And if you're unable to get up, then you're not really in control anymore. It's very easy to get injured. Whereas if you've come down really slowly and you're like, right, I'm not actually going to finish this rep, I'm failing, you've got a bit of time to think about dumping the bar and throwing yourself forward, and you haven't let that massive spike in forces occur. So you're probably going to experience a lower risk of injury either in the short term or long term if you're controlling your repetitions. I think that's a pretty reasonable statement. So they're kind of some of the overall big picture and little picture considerations as to what the training variables are for setting up a training program. There are like longer term considerations, like how you progress your sessions, how you periodize over time, but they're kind of beyond the scope of what I want to cover, at least in this segment.